proof, and indeed experience not only of God, but of answered prayer. For those looking for more evidence, this research may not prove the existence of God, but the results, most certainly, may make it more difficult not to believe in him.
John, how do you react to that as a scientist? Does that experiment with the heart patient stand up scientifically?
Well, it sounds very tedious and pedantic, but we don't know remotely enough from what we saw to tell. It's clear that the people doing these kinds of experiments are aware of many of the aspects of scientific method, and they are trying to apply them. But especially when you're looking at something as surprising, and from a scientific point of view probably inexplicable, as a possible direct influence of prayer on people getting well without their knowledge, you're going to need very, very good evidence before any neutral scientist is likely to accept it. I don't think we're there yet.
Russell Stannard, you're a physicist and you're a Christian. What do you make of this experiment? Is it a true scientific experiment?
I don't know very much about the experiment he was talking about, but I do know quite a bit about the one that was mentioned that will have results in 2002. I'm a trustee on the foundation that financed it. That has been very carefully set up. It's a long experiment lasting out over a period of 2 to 3 years. And I think indeed, if that does turn up with a positive result, it will be very interesting. It will show that for whatever reason, that kind of prayer does work.
Roy Hattersley, if people are getting better, if a certain number of people are getting better when they're prayed for, that's fine, isn't it? That proves something.
Well, it's fine, but it isn't connected to prayer. I mean, the entire thesis we've seen this evening, which I think is terribly misusing the language to talk about experiments and proof, is based on a classic philosophical error called post hoc ergo propter hoc. One thing follows another, and therefore it's assumed that the second thing was related to the first. And there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that at all in the film this evening. I might also say that as well as being totally lacking in evidence, it seems to me to redound terribly on Christianity if it's true. I mean, what sort of a God is it that allows this little boy to die if he's not prayed for, but allows him to survive because he is prayed for? It's a very strange God that makes that sort of distinction.
Gerald, what do you make of that?
Well, the only argument there is that you would prefer that we live in a world where there is no outside help, where we're alone in the universe, which is a very frightening thing. And I think the Christian tradition of prayer is a lot more than a God up there who arbitrarily says yes or no. I will answer prayer.
That's what he did.
There are other spiritual forces at work in the world which can hinder prayer, hinder me giving prayer, hinder God answering prayer. And in the Christian story, a man prays and an angel eventually turns up and says, I'm really sorry I'm late, but it's taken me 3 weeks to get here.
Let me ask Karen, why do you think Christians at this particular time are driven to try to prove that prayer works? What is going on here?
It's a mistake. God, the best theologians have always maintained, lies beyond empirical proof. God lies beyond sense data. You cannot prove or disprove that there is a God. Further, but what comes up from this, and I agree with Roy here, is a heresy. I think what's coming up is a completely wrong conception of God. Any kind of God that is so selective and who says, I'm not praying, I'm not answering during these 10 people here because nobody's praying for them. But I would think that the Christian God would precisely want to cure those people who didn't, who weren't prayed for, who hadn't got anyone to love them or care for them in that way.
Well, I think it tells us something. We shouldn't necessarily just throw the spotlight of blame on Christian communities. I think part of the blame lies in a culture which assumes that the only kinds of questions that are interesting or valuable are scientific questions. And what's happening here, I think, is that Christians are feeling under pressure to conform to the canons of science in order to try to demonstrate the validity or the meaningfulness or even the truthfulness of what they believe. And I think down that path lie real problems for belief. And it's not just peculiar on the part of God, what God is supposed to be doing. It's peculiar on the part of what the believers are supposed to be doing. What kind of sincerity is it that a believer is supposed to have when they are supposed to be praying arbitrarily for people they don't know and not for other people who they know exist who also need help?
Well, wait a minute, let's listen to the Christian point of view. Faith is a great gift in religion, and if you could prove something, do you not damaged faith,
Look,
the nature
can
of
I
faith?
make it quite clear on behalf of the experimenters in both the experiments we're talking about, they make it absolutely clear that this is not in any way meant to be a proof of God's existence. They fully accept that if a positive result comes out of this, it could be interpreted as some kind of telepathic link which goes directly across from the intercessor to the patient rather than to God and then God down. So there's no question about trying to prove. It is simply a scientific experiment to investigate the phenomenology. As
I'm
regards this
suggesting that it's a scientific experiment that Christians would be well advised not to get involved with because it is damaging to their faith.
What do you say to
I
that?
would say it is not damaging to the faith because as someone who believes myself, I myself am very confused as to what is the value on a Sunday of praying for somebody on the sick list that I don't know. What is the value of praying for people in Mozambique? Now, if this experiment, for whatever reason, turns out to have a positive result, I personally will have to take very much more seriously the idea of praying for people I don't know. I shall have to rethink out how I cooperate with God in this matter of prayer.
Right.
This is a sign of weakness. The one religion that is expanding fast in the world, and expanding in this country, Islam, would regard this as a terrible heresy. They would say God doesn't need you to go through these experiments, phony or genuine. Yeah. And indeed, for many periods, the church would have said the same thing. In the 18th century, which I'm beginning to know about because I'm writing a biography of John Wesley, this would have been called enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is the pretense that you have a particular and personal relationship with God. You can get on with God individually, which is regarded as heresy in most of the church.
Gerald, wait a minute. We've accused him of heresy. Let the man answer.
Well, I don't think we've got church decline in the West because of enthusiasm, quite the opposite. And in fact...
The special use of the word enthusiasm.
Well,
it's not being keen, it's thinking you can speak to God directly.
Well, I'm a great follower of Wesley and Count Zinzendorf and the others who brought revival to the UK. And it's very interesting that the early batch of, if you like, modern scientists nearly all had a personal faith in God and in God.
That's not the point.
I think the point is that if you do this, you get bad science on the one hand, as in that film, and bad religion on the other. And I think that this is one of the great problems of religion in the scientific modern West. It's a process that began in the 16th century that we think, as John said, that the only kind of truth worth having is that which can be scientifically demonstrable. Before, in the pre-modern world, this was not so. There were two ways of reaching at truth. One was logos, science, reason. The other was mythos, that which was intuitive, which was mystical, which was spiritual, rather like the knowledge we derive from art.
Well, what's wrong with mixing the two? Because for Gerald, if he can prove to people's satisfaction that prayer works, his own faith and that of Christians is strengthened.
Well, I think that that the idea of God that is being promoted through this is a wrong idea of God. It's an uncompassionate idea of God. Furthermore, it's most religions teach that you become most fully aware and most fully religious when you give yourself away, not when you're going to get something from the deity, like what do I get out of this? It's about, as Islam means surrender.
But of course these people didn't know they were going to get anything at all. That's the whole point.
No, but we want to prove that God exists. We want to have some nice
that
data.
That is not the aim of the experiment.
I'm glad to hear that.
And Karen, you talk about bad science. I have examined the experimental techniques that these people are using in the second experiment I was talking about. And as far as scientific methodology is concerned, it is absolutely kosher. It is absolutely fine. Which doesn't mean to say that this prayer experiment is on the same level as the kind of experiments I would do in a physical laboratory. If you're dealing in this, as in this case, with someone who's got a mind of their own, God, or with anybody else, if you're experimenting on people who've got a mind of their own, they can quite simply decide not to cooperate. So that is a big difference. It doesn't make it bad science, it makes it a different kind of science.
Well, Roy, can we be clear why it is good science? I mean, when you say this is relevant and real, you're able actually to connect the prayer to the recovery. It's not a matter of correlation. It's not a matter that it happens after prayer. You can connect the two things.
Well, hang on. I would want to take issue there because, I mean, for years...
Let him tell me whether he can do it or not.
Well, he can't.
Well, with these, the clever thing about these experiments is that you have a control group.
Yeah.
Okay,
No,
John.
In this case, you've got two groups.
but we must-
One have prayed and both.
But that is not to
otherwise
Roy's
they're
point
the
with
same.
respect, and I disagree with both of you. Roy's point is that you only have correlations here.
Yeah.
We only can correlate, in the nature
Yeah,
of the
oh, yeah.
experiment, we can correlate possibly the acts of praying on the one side and the act of getting well on the other.
Yeah.
Well, that's very different from proving a causal relationship, and that is, I think, your point.
That is my point.
Now, I would say, though, on the other hand, you can do perfectly good science on correlations. How did we learn that smoking causes lung cancer? Nobody knew how it might do it. For years after we had established to our own satisfaction that the correlations were so strong and so replicable that really it was overwhelming evidence that there was a link and you'd be wise not to smoke. And so I think we should not expect the religious experiments to conform to a higher ideal than science.
that's
I
the
want to,
second
I
point,
want
which
to, I want to just
that's
leave
right.
that particular experiment behind a moment, because there are lots of other demonstrations and evidence and published evidence that people who pray themselves
Yep.
have benefit from it. It might be medical, it might be spiritual, it might be to do with serenity, long life. There's considerable scientific evidence that these things are happening. So is this a question of the human psyche thinking itself well, or are we talking about a God out there or not?
I think that prayer is for us. It's helping us to use language in a less defensive and self-protecting way, thanking wholeheartedly, admitting total guilt instead of all those qualified apologies we give outside, expressing our total neediness, something that we don't then do much in the outside world because it's tough out there and you have to survive. Now, once you have emptied yourself of this cautionary egotism, then you are ready for a spiritual and religious experience and serenity and some of those other things that I think.
Yes,
I think that's what prayer is.
But
Gerard?
objectively, this God now can't do anything. This is all you getting yourself ready for something or other.
Yes, and because God is mysterious, God is ineffable, God cannot be predicted. God is not another being. God is a totally different level of reality.
But that is not
But
what
if you-
Jesus taught, is it? He taught his disciples to pray. He taught them how to pray.
But I do
John?
think we're at risk of overlooking slightly what could be the most interesting aspect of all this. It seems to me that there probably is quite good evidence that quite a lot of people get benefit of one sort or another from praying. And it seems to me that it is not a puzzle necessarily to science, and nothing for science to fear, in the idea that that human nature is such that certain kinds of act of contemplation, of reflection, or even of what we call prayer may, in certain circumstances, have beneficial effects. They may even, on average, prolong longevity. I think that's probably quite likely.
So prayer is a technique, Roy. Do you think the technique for making life
I
more
really have
tolerable?
no idea what prayer is.
I don't believe that. I don't believe
I
that.
have no idea what prayer
I don't believe that.
But if I want to return, if you'll let me, to this boring test of proper scientific method, because there's the other question, which may be an indictment of God, which is the other half of whether it's just correlation or not, because as John rightly said, well, the other test of scientific experiment is whether it's repeatable, whether it happens a second time.
Absolutely.
Now, if you find this happens with your little group, are we to assume it'll happen every time anybody reproduces this experiment, replicates it? Can it go on doing time after time? Or is God going to discriminate from time to time?
Certainly, if there's a positive result, then I would imagine there'd be lots and lots of experiments. In fact, one can say that
Well,
these
that's-
experiments
but
have,
will it happen every time?
arisen out of an experiment carried out by Bird in 1988, where he got a positive result. This Kansas experiment has also got a positive result. Okay, so already this business of checking on people's previous positive results is already going on.
Gerald, let me ask you, if we treat prayer as a technique for making our lives better, does that fly in the face of your faith, or does it simply prove it a different way?
Yes, I don't think there is a technique. I think that the fact of the matter is sometimes we look to God for something and it's happened, and there are other times when we might pray for years for things and it doesn't happen. And I come back to the fact that life is very complex in terms of the powers of darkness and of light and of the various forms of prayer. And it sounds as though God arbitrarily chooses to answer and not answer. My problem with Karen is that this God with whom she has contemplated and is up there and out there and is somewhat mysterious, now cannot respond. And you can never prove that he can respond. And so you ask the question, well, why bother to pray at all?
Well, prayer is something that human beings do, but if we are relying on God to answer our prayers, to have faith, then I think our faith is in jeopardy, because God doesn't seem to answer our prayers. God hasn't been answering the prayers of the people in Mozambique this last week. God hasn't been helping the people in Kosovo who were murdered, and doubtless they were all praying, and people were praying for them here. But God is not just out there, God is within. And when we descend within ourselves, we become aware of a mysterious presence in the ground of our being that gives meaning to life.
I take that point. If we think of prayer as a technique for making our lives better, then of course there are plenty of other techniques, and often they involve looking not to an external God to answer prayers, but within ourselves to develop our own potential. Here, hypnotist Paul McKenna explains his belief in the vast untapped resources of the human mind.